Slava Mariupol, Our Family Story, Episode 4, Prelude to Invasion. Although I could begin sooner, I'll start with the 1991 national referendum in which Ukrainians voted whether or not to remain part of the Soviet Union. On the eve of the election in August 1991, the President of the United States visited Ukraine and addressed the nation in what later became known as the Chicken Kiev speech. In the speech, the President of the United States urged Ukrainians to remain part of the USSR. The people soundly, overwhelmingly disregarded his advice and voted to become an independent nation, including Donbass at 83%. At the end of the Soviet Union, Ukraine inherited the world's third largest nuclear arsenal, which was a situation that neither the West nor Russia could tolerate. So they descended upon Ukraine in the early 1990s in an effort to disarm the country. The result of that effort was the Budapest Memorandum signed on December 5th, 1994 by USA, Russia, United Kingdom, and Ukraine. Terms of the agreement were that Ukraine surrenders its entire nuclear arsenal to Russia, while USA pays the costs. All parties agreed on paper to recognize Ukraine's territorial integrity. However, there was a long delay in final signing of the agreement due to Ukrainian concerns about their own security from Russia if they lose their nuclear deterrent. Eventually, the President of the United States lost patience with Ukraine, traveled to Kyiv, and told them to sign the agreement or risk harming their relationship with the USA. Now, Ukraine was in a very delicate situation. Not only were they a new country, but they already had a problem superpower right on their border. They were very hesitant to alienate a different superpower. Finally, USA lawyers drafted some intentionally vague language about security assurances while making sure there were no guarantees. France had been a party to these negotiations up until this point, when they withdrew in disgust and refused to sign. Their President Mitterrand called the Budapest Memorandum a trick, and he was proven to be 100% correct. That same President of the United States later admitted in April 2023 that Russia would have never attacked if Ukraine had their weapons. The concept of Russian world or Ruski Mir was embraced by the Kremlin beginning in the early 2000s, and Putin later sponsored an official foundation in 2007 to advance this idea. The central precept of Russian world is that Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus form a single spiritual civilization united by Russian language, Russian culture, and the Russian Orthodox Church. That church and its leader, the Moscow Patriarchate, act as an official tool of the Kremlin. They consult with the Kremlin on policy decisions and sell that policy to the people from the pulpits at the church. In Ruski Mir, Russians are called Great Russians, Belarusians White Russians, and Ukrainians Little Russians, but there's all still Russians. Russian world includes a duty to protect Russian speakers in neighboring countries, whether they like it or not. Alongside the idea of Ruski Mir, Many of the same people in the Kremlin openly promoted the revival of Novorossiya, which was a territory of the Russian Empire prior to the Soviet Union that included much of southern and eastern Ukraine. Here's a photo of a map on the wall of an official DNR office in occupied Donbass, with Novorossiya shown here in pink. Mariupol's right in the middle of Novorossiya. In April 2008, at the Bucharest summit, NATO issued an official statement that both Georgia and Ukraine would become NATO members, but they failed to offer any pathway or mechanism for that to happen. NATO practice is to refuse admission to any country that is involved in a territorial dispute. So Russia, knowing this, introduced a territorial dispute into Georgia 4 months later in August 2008 by invading their southern neighbor. Russia captured 20% of Georgian territory, which they still hold today. The reaction by the West was extremely weak. The U.S. president promised diplomatic efforts and issued strong words of condemnation. Back in Ukraine, the Euromaidan movement began in November 2013 and culminated a few months later when their president Yanukovych fled the country to Russia. This left a temporary leadership vacuum in Ukraine, which Russia took advantage of by sending their little green men to occupy Crimea. As before, the reaction by the West was very weak. This pattern of weak Western response gave Putin the green light to go after Donbass in April 2014. In Mariupol, around 200 armed DNR took over the city hall, erecting tires and barricades. A few blocks away, they burned down the police station. They shot guns in the air, drank alcohol, and set fires. But they were only able to attract fewer than 1,000 supporters. 99% of Mariupol residents simply stayed home. The stores were open, the power was on, and they found no reason to come anywhere near this place. As we heard in episode 2, Azov Battalion had been formed in May 2014 over in Berdansk, but it took them a few weeks to organize and improvise some weapons. In June 2014, Azov counterattacked Mariupol and was quite easily able to drive off and clean the city of DNR and Russia. This is when Azov began to really earn their stripes and their reputation. The city was completely liberated by June 15th, 2014, which was later celebrated during my time in Mariupol as Liberation Day holiday. Here you can see what Freedom Square looked like before its renovation with the old concrete slabs and the metal stage. On July 17th, 2014, Russia and DNR shot down a civilian airliner MH17 which was flying over Donbass, killing over 200 civilians. Immediately after shooting down the plane, DNR posted celebratory videos on Facebook. However, upon finding out that they had shot down a civilian plane, they quickly deleted these videos. On January 24th, 2015, Russia launched a missile attack on the left bank of Mariupol, killing over 30 people. My family fled north to stay with in-laws for a few weeks until they felt it was safe to return home. Although DNR had been driven out of Mariupol, they were still close enough to the east to attack the left bank, as we just saw. Therefore, Azov Battalion launched another counteroffensive in February 2015 and successfully pushed DNR back past the coastal town of Shyrokina, which is 8 miles east of the Mariupol city limits. 2 days later, on February 12th, Minsk II agreement was signed, which called for ceasefire in Donbass, removal of heavy weapons, special status for Donetsk and Lugansk, local elections in Donbass, amnesty for fighters, and Ukrainian control of the international border. None of these things ever happened. But what this agreement did do is freeze the front lines so that neither side tried to advance. After Minsk II, the fighting 8 miles east of Mariupol never really stopped. There were casualties every week, the sound of artillery fire, but what it really boiled down to was World War I style trench warfare with drones. Left behind in Mariupol as reminders were the destroyed City Hall on Greek Square and the burned out police station a few blocks south of the Drum Theater. On May 15, 2018, the Kerch Bridge opened, connecting southwestern Russia with the occupied Crimea Peninsula. The height of only 35 meters above the waterline prevented the largest container ships from passing under the bridge, thereby blocking them from reaching Ukrainian ports of Mariupol and Berdansk. Those ships could reach Russian ports on the Azov Sea by going around the bridge through Russian territory upriver. Russia also implemented long inspection delays for any vessels bound for Mariupol and Berdansk, sometimes a week or longer, which caused ship owners to begin to reroute elsewhere. In November 2018, shortly after we had moved back to Mariupol, began the Azov Sea incidents. In this clip, Russia captures a Ukrainian tugboat and 2 naval cutters in international waters in the Black Sea as they approach the Kerch Strait. Russia also harassed, boarded, and even arrested fishermen working in the Azov Sea. President Poroshenko declared martial law for a couple months, which was a little bit of a scary situation, at least for me. The spring of 2021 brought a massive Russian military buildup along Ukraine's borders. 40,000 Russian troops moved to the border area near Voronezh for exercises in April 2021. Another 32,000 moved to Crimea Peninsula for exercises, and additional troops were sent up to the northern border of Ukraine in Belarus. These troops on exercises joined tens of thousands of Russian troops that were already permanently stationed in these same areas. The net result of all this was that Ukraine was surrounded on 3 sides. On July 12, 2021, Vladimir Putin published an article on the Kremlin website titled "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians." In this warped historical narrative, he claims that Ukrainians and Russians are one single people who have been wrongly separated and must be reunited. He regards Ukraine itself as an artificial entity created out of Russian lands by the Bolsheviks, who he blames primarily for the Ukrainian problem. He then goes on to blame Gorbachev for allowing this artificial entity of Ukraine to leave the USSR and the Russian sphere. Any desires in Ukraine for independence or even just a modern standard of living are due to malign Western influence and are signs of decadence. He alleges persecution and murder of Russian speakers in Ukraine and says that Kiev simply does not need Donbass. Overall, the tone of this essay is paternalistic. I would compare it to the story of the prodigal son who has left home and needs to be brought back. Here we have the typical sarcastic Ukrainian response. After April, the Russian troops surrounding Ukraine on three sides never really left. So, using that as an implicit threat, on December 15th, Russia issued a public ultimatum via their website to NATO, in which they demanded no further NATO enlargement, especially in Ukraine, and withdrawal of NATO troops from 12 former Soviet bloc countries that Russia still considered to be within its sphere of influence. Russia knew that these were non-starters, I think, but NATO members consulted among themselves for a few weeks before rejecting demands about which countries can join, as that was considered to be sovereign decision that each nation makes as to who its allies will be. It called on Russia to withdraw from Donbass and Crimea in Ukraine, northern Georgia, and Transnistria in Moldova. The counterproposal offered to validate locations of cruise missiles in border areas on both sides and to limit the size and locations of military exercises on both sides. February 17th, 2022, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a public final rejection and refusal to discuss anything further, stating that the West had disregarded the package nature of the Russian proposals, which were take it or leave it. They stated flat out that no Russian invasion in Ukraine is happening or being planned, yet we all know what happened 1 week later. The MFA stated that Moscow will respond to the inadequate Western counterproposal, including military technical measures. 4 days later, on February 21st, Putin addressed the Russian nation concerning the events in Ukraine. In this speech, he repeated many of the same historical falsehoods from his earlier essay. He formally recognized Donetsk and Lugansk republics as independent nations, thereby throwing Minsk II and Budapest Memorandum right out the window. He announced that a treaty of friendship and mutual assistance had been signed with DNR-LNR. The very next day, that treaty was ratified by the Russian Duma, and DNR-LNR immediately invoked their right to formally request military assistance from Russia. That evening in Mariupol, a lot of local residents and families appeared spontaneously in front of the Drum Theater to show their support for Ukraine. This last piece is out of order, but I'll discuss it here anyway. It's titled, "What Should Russia Do with Ukraine?" written by Timothy Sergetsev and published on April 4th, 2022 in the official media outlet of the Russian government, RIA Novosti. It was published there and it remains there today, which tells me that this article represents official Kremlin policy. The publication date of April 4th is significant because it's only 1 or 2 days after all the Russian atrocities against civilians in Bucha had been discovered, yet they went ahead with publication anyway. This piece is a recipe for extermination of the Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian nation, Ukrainian language. It says that denazification is aimed at the Nazified bulk of the population, which, as you recall, means anyone in Ukraine who doesn't want to be Russian. A significant number of common people are guilty of being passive Nazis and Nazi accomplices. Here it's explicit that denazification includes de-Ukrainization, since those two are basically synonymous with each other. The last excerpt concerns collective punishment, in which the social bog, which has actively and passively supported the Nazis through action and inaction, must go through the hardships of war as a historical lesson and redemption of guilt. History has shown that the tragedies and dramas of wartime benefit the peoples who were tempted and carried away by their role as the enemy of Russia. As you can see, this piece takes a very harsh, punitive tone, to put it mildly. So different from the paternal tone that Putin had taken a few months earlier in July 2021. The reason for that is that by April, when this was published, it had become clear that the Ukrainian people did not welcome liberation as they expected, but instead would fight the invaders tooth and nail for every inch of their land. To me, this piece could be retitled as "What Should Russia Do with Mariupol?" Because, as you recall, in 2014, DNR and Russia had a foothold in the city, had captured the city hall, yet the population stayed home. They were passive. They were inactive. They were Nazi accomplices. If the people would have come out in numbers and supported DNR, then Russia would have held the city. But it didn't happen. Russia never forgot this. So to me, this piece is aimed right at the heart of Mariupol. That's it for this episode. Thank you for watching. Next episode is the invasion of February 24th, 2022.